Live from Germany, we're delighted to be joined by Robert Rogers, the head of English football operations for Impect Analysis, who are doing some innovative and groundbreaking work in the world of analysis and analytics. Good morning, Robert. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Thanks, Dave. I thought you might have led with Guten Morgen, but yeah, very well. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Yes, and having recently phoned you, it was intriguing to see that your answer phone message is bilingual in both German and English. So you've been there a while now, an Englishman abroad. How and when did you end up in Germany?
Yeah, it's been 5 years now, so it feels a lot longer considering that includes the period of COVID where I might as well have been living back in England. But yeah, it's been a really interesting transition. I moved over 5 years ago, essentially to pursue this opportunity with Impact. On a personal side of things, I've now ended up with a German wife and a German child, which is very nice to be able to integrate into the culture. But the idea was from an impact side of things to be able to further bring the company along within the English market. So it's quite well adopted in Germany. It was back then, and I guess it's now branched out to a certain extent in the UK. But yeah, having kind of previously gone through the idea of impact and packing data, I'm sure we'll get through in earlier work. It was a really nice opportunity for me to work with the company.
Robert, one thing that strikes me with the company, and obviously we've worked with you guys for a while now, and it's something I really believe in as a product that you offer. And the reason I do is, it started, of course, with two footballers, Jens and Stefan. But so actually, could you give us a bit of an idea of why on earth they decided to head into data? Was it their own experiences? Was it a lack of data in at the teams at the time? Give us a little bit of context behind the company and why they started it.
Yeah, so I guess context is absolutely the right way to introduce this. Yeah, the two former players that you mentioned there, Gary, Jens Hegeler and Stefan Reinartz, they both played football together. I guess they've got quite a number of Bundesliga appearances between them, but they were at Bayer Leverkusen at the time. Their manager used to put stuff up on the dressing room wall. It was, I guess, what we would now think of as very basic data, probably stuff we'd see more on the TV nowadays. So you're talking about possession of the ball, pass completion rates, aerial duel rate, distance covered. For whatever reason, Jens and Stefan felt that didn't really reflect their game particularly well, and it didn't really give a true reflection of how the team played. But for better or for worse, the players were being assessed on this data. So that was kind of the initial idea that, well, perhaps what we're being assessed on is not groundbreaking and not really telling us a true story. This is around about 2014 time, and around about the same time, they were invited to a debate at the Sports University of Cologne here. I guess it's a very important university when it comes to sport within the country. And the head of data from the university actually went through essentially individually for each sport the correlation to the end result for individual data that was being used at the time. Stefan and Jens, being invited in their roles of footballers, kind of told the crowd about how data was being used at the top end of the sport. You would think that Bayer Leverkusen would be quite groundbreaking, but I guess the hammer blow was that the data chief in the university said actually none of the data within football gives you a true idea about what happened in the game. The correlation to the end result, as in which team goes on to win the game, if they had more ball possession, if they had higher amount of duels won, was actually very low. So that was the origin story for Stefan and Jens to try and measure something a bit more contextual and something that gave you a better idea about what happened in a game.
See, that was a problem, Dave. But back in the day, as we well know, if you were a defender like me, who was an average defender, data was a stick that they used to beat you with as a manager, because he'd say, "Oh, your pass percentage is not as good as Man United's defenders, or you're not covering enough distance." And I'm thinking, well, if I cover loads of distance, basically I'm out of position most of the time. So it was very difficult back in the day, wasn't it? Because because it was so new, but also nobody really knew how to use it. And actually, I think it actually impaired performance back in the day. So this is why I love Impect so much, because I've got some like-minded people there that are trying to make defenders look better, certainly, the wooden ones like myself.
Well, I think you also can look at the stories that have come out of Bolton, where if you hadn't run 10K in a game, you didn't play, So in the early days of analysis, we had crude tools providing crude data. And it was really easy to make a correlation between run far and win, or have lots of the ball and win. Whereas actually, it's nothing like that, really, Robert, is it? It's not as basic and as simple as that.
No, and I guess it's just human nature to look for an absolutism and say, we'll figure it out by doing this or that. It's thankfully the game is far more nuanced than that, and there's many different ways to win a game of football. So as much as we try and measure things that have a higher correlation to the end result, it is actually one of the main things that we will mention, that there's no real way of playing the game that we believe is correct. We just want to be able to describe it for the clubs so that they can fit things to their game model and describe how well they've played and fit to it, whether that's from an analysis perspective or whether they're trying to recruit somebody that would fit in line with that type of way. I am hopeful, perhaps I'm a little bit romantic, that our game will never be figured out in that way, and that we will have different styles of play. Not everybody will play in the exact same structure and system, because that tends to be what makes the game great. And I think that anybody who's trying to say that they've figured the game out already with data it might be a lot better than a few years ago, but it's still nowhere near to a point where we know exactly everything that goes on and how to fix it.
Robert, to get the data, give people an understanding of a company like Impect. So, obviously we've mentioned, the two guys that sort of founded the company, yourself and different people, but there's over, is it something like 150 people involved in the process of creating some of these reports? And, how does that sort of work? Give us an idea of the size of the operation.
Yeah. So I guess it maybe is a little bit unknown to people who use the data, but it takes a lot of work to go into it. It's certainly not a simple thing to set up. So basically we have two different arms. We have here in Germany, I guess our office here that has maybe around about 30 people. It's data scientists, software developers, because we have our own platform. There's people that will write reports and be kind of experts on the game of football, and people who will do customer care, so that the people who are actually using the data get an idea of things. But then we've also got, I guess, a small army of people who collect the data. So it's well over 300 people whose full-time job is to also then collect the data. It takes a long time to collect. It can take 9 to 10 hours per game when you take into account the collection techniques, the quality control that goes into it. It's a bit longer than, I guess, other providers in some ways. But we believe it's important to be able to add the extra layer of context that's needed. So by no means is it a simple process. I just think that sometimes it's worth taking a little bit of extra time to get things right. And I guess we'll talk about it a little bit later, but bad data can also sometimes be a hindrance to clubs as opposed to help them. It's important to get it right.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, when people talk about data? The quality of the information coming in is so important, because bad data in is bad decision making, and unfortunately it can lead to bad results. Whereas the one thing, at least when you've got good quality control, and certainly the scientist in me wants to make sure that there's a high level of rigor around that collection. You say about the people who are doing this collection, have they got backgrounds in football, or are they more people who are specialists in being able to collect and interpret the data?
Yeah, it's a really interesting debate, actually, from a data collection perspective, because if you have people who are football experts, so to speak, they kind of need to not cross the barrier of going from objective data collection to subjective data collection. For example, if you're watching a game and, I don't know, it's John Stones who tries to make a pass, we might think, we know what he was trying to do there. It's John Stones. I'll say that was a certain type of pass. It needs to be completely objective. People need to be taught to collect the data in a way that doesn't give any biases from a human perspective at all. So, I mean, the people who collect the data are, I guess, football fans, but we try and make sure that they're not using any of their human bias to collect the data themselves. In theory, providing they understand the points of data that they need to collect, they don't necessarily need to be aware of certain aspects of football, it then comes to how we interpret the data and how we create KPIs from the raw data that's been collected.
Robert, your main, when you mentioned obviously you guys are over in Germany. Obviously, the two guys have founded are German. So, and that's your sort of main. Obviously, you have other markets, and I'm pretty sure very strong in the UK as well. But how many sort of clubs? Give us an idea of how many clubs would use this product over in Germany. Let's say in the top flight or beyond.
Yeah, in the Bundesliga, I think it's 15 of 18 for the current season are using it either for analysis or recruitment or for both. So I always think of it as a kind of a household name here in Germany. It's the go-to thing to be used. It's taken some time to get to that point, but I think in general, clubs in Germany are pretty adept at using data. And I guess around the world as well. I guess we're working with over 100 clubs and associations at the moment. So there's clubs in every corner of the world that are using the data now, and it makes me very proud to be able to say so. That some are also gaining some insights from what we do.
Why are so many clubs in Germany using your data? Do you think, without sort of putting a negative spin on it, do you think German clubs are slightly more advanced on the whole? In the way that they think? Is it the sporting director's been there a lot longer? As a position, again, this is not a criticism of UK clubs because obviously, we've worked in a lot of them. But do you think German clubs use it a lot more effectively at the moment, or why is it so strong there?
Not necessarily. I think I guess we can see it from a perspective of having worked in the English game. We often probably look to Germany and think, they know what they're doing. They've won a certain amount of trophies at club and national team level, so they obviously are better at working with data and analysis and tactics. I wouldn't say it's the case. There are some clubs over here that are very basic. Not to say that they don't get use out of the data, but it's no more advanced. I'd certainly say the Premier League itself is probably the most advanced league in terms of using data. So it's not the case that the Bundesliga is any better. The Premier League, I guess, are using different data providers. I often think that it's, first of all, due to the fact that our company is German. I guess we were first to speak to a lot of the clubs, and they were able to adopt this kind of technique that we have of using data. Whereas in the UK, you spoke about it in previous podcasts, that data was used from a certain point onwards, and I guess the likes of an Opta, it being shown on TV, everybody became aware of a certain way of seeing the game with data. And they've just kind of run with it and decided that approach is the right way. And obviously it's been added to and it's been contextualized to a certain extent. But very often when we speak to English clubs and they're not aware of what we do, it's almost like starting from scratch. The way that we see the game is a completely different point of view with data. It's not the case in Germany. I think this whole idea of packing, which is the name of the data that we collect, is kind of ingrained into the whole ethos of German football as a whole.
So, Robert, you brought it on to packing there, and it probably is the standout element when I saw the first presentation that you guys did. I think it was at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium a couple of years ago. And it was kind of, wow, this is like watching football through a completely different lens and seeing the data that the game produces presented in a completely different way. For those listeners or those people watching, describe to us the type of analysis that you do and why it's so different to the standard stuff that people would have been used to in the past.
Yeah, thanks for saying it, David. I suppose the main idea is to try and measure effectiveness in a game. And I think from the starting point of what Stefan and Jens thought about, was it useful to collect, was more to do with how many players are taken out of the game with each individual action, as opposed to counting the actions, which is kind of the approach that has been done in the past, and I guess has been kind of done to death in terms of how we present that and look at pass completion rates and total attempted passes and this type of thing. We have always measured from the start how many players are taken out of the game with a pass, with a dribble, with a long ball, any way in which you can take a player out of the game. So we call that packing. And essentially, each individual player that's taken out of the game by a player or a team, we have a score at the end of the match for bypassed opponents. Now, there are other ways in which you can take players out of the game. I think bypassed opponents is the one that's most well known from us. Certainly having been brought up to probably kick it long more than try and keep the ball on the floor like they do over here. I'm also a big fan of the idea of removing opponents as opposed to bypassing them. The idea of this is winning the ball back in high areas, then how many players are beyond the ball that have been taken out of the game to a certain extent. This is also a type of packing. And that kind of brings me back to the point I made in the first place. There's no right way of playing the game. Each individual approach has its place with the tools that you have at your disposal within a club. We're just trying to be able to measure what's been effective, whether you're winning it back from a high ball or whether you're progressing the ball along the floor or breaking the lines in that way.
And I think that's the key to it, isn't it? And that's where I think the context is there, isn't it? If I'm a for people listening to this, if I'm a midfielder and I receive the ball and, the old way of measuring it or maybe other people's way of measuring it, I can go backwards, sideways. I can go absolutely nowhere, but yet I get a completed pass. I get a number of passes. I could end up with, 100 passes in the game, but actually none of my passes are effective. So therefore, my performance hasn't been affected. Whereas, with your data, all of a sudden you can see just how effective that pass is in putting your team on the attack or getting your team into a really dangerous area, not just on the floor, breaking the lines essentially. I thought I'd get that in. But you could actually play, you could actually play over the top of the line. So even a longer ball that goes over the top and puts a striker in on goal, whilst it's a long ball, is also an incredibly effective pass. So, how do you so again, just give us that again, really, Robert. How do you measure that pass? So if I take two players out of the game, if I take 7, so just give us a bit more of a sort of an idea of exactly how you'd measure that.
Yeah, so essentially, the people that would collect the data, when the ball is received by a player, that's the start of that player's possession. They would stop it there and they'd measure how many players are left between the ball and the center of the goal to make it as objective as possible. Obviously, they know how many players are between the ball and the center of the goal. They don't have to interpret anything themselves. That's a fact, distance-wise, how many players are closer. And then, obviously, whatever the player does, whether they dribble, take a touch, make a pass, when the ball is then given to one of their teammates, we'd stop it on the first touch of the teammate, providing they then control that ball. We'd measure again how many players are left between the ball and the center of the opposition goal. And we look at essentially how many players the player is originally taken out of the game. So, let's say they started off with 7 players between the ball and the goal. They take a touch, they play a pass between the lines. It takes 3 opposition players out. They would get a +3 for bypassed opponents, very simply on that.
I think, and also one of the things that I found really, really interesting, it was fascinating for me, is that we always see, a lot of the stats seem to be kind of not, a lot of the stats that companies show or TV show seems to be all around possession and all around all of those attributes. But also, you can also bypass defenders in a defensive action, can't you? By intercepting, by pressing, by being very controlled out of possession. So sort of give us an idea of how that might measure, in terms of if I intercept something and actually, can I still bypass defenders in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think it's important to be able to add that layer of context because it's another way of harming the opposition. So, if we're playing out from the back, our team, and we get pressed, I get pressed and I lose the ball, essentially, our team's gone obviously from being in possession to losing possession. The players then further away from the goal than the ball from my team have been removed from the game by me losing it. So that opposition player who's won the ball from me would then get +9 for removed opponents. If it's just me and maybe you, Gary, left next to me at centre-back that can defend this action. So it's a way of really measuring how effective that individual action was. And obviously there is a way to look at this with typical data that you've just mentioned, but it would just be called one interception or one tackle, as opposed to being able to contextualize, well, how effective was that one interception, that one tackle? Sometimes these happen on the center circle. That can mean completely different things. If you're playing against Man City one week, you maybe won it from the Man City centre back and you threw in a one-on-one. If you're playing against Everton next week, you might have won it from the centre forward and you've still got 10 players left to beat. So adding that extra layer of context is really the most important thing that we see, as opposed to just counting the amount of actions and essentially saying where it happens on the pitch.
Yeah, it's great to see that you've got both sides of the game covered there, not just what you do in possession, but how elements out of possession perhaps contribute to attacks, because while we can see passes per defensive action as something that people are far more aware of now, but this idea of we've certainly been more aware of pressing styles in recent years, haven't we? You know, whether it was Gengen pressing under Klopp or maybe what Bielsa did. Are we seeing now that the way teams press and how that contributes to attacks is that becoming far more understood by coaches and by players?
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably be careful on what I say. It's one of my pet peeves, the PPDA, passes per defensive action, because it was a proxy. It was a way of looking at, you know, defensive actions by a team without really knowing what they were doing. Were they pressing or were they not? Essentially, you know, I guess anybody that doesn't understand it, it's essentially the amount of passes that have been able to be attempted by a certain team before the opposition made some sort of defensive action, so a tackle, an interception, a block, anything like that. Now, if you play against, let's say, for example, Diego Simeone's Atletico Madrid, maybe not now, but 5 years ago, they would let most teams, if they wanted to, pass the ball around the back four constantly until they hit a certain point in the pitch. And then they press you like there was no tomorrow. PPDA thinks that they're very, very poor at pressing, or at least it believes that they're a low intensity team. You need to add the context of what is happening. How are they pressing? Is it at a certain point that they press on the pitch or within their own formation? People have certain pressing triggers that they try and look into. And being able to add this nuanced data that describes exactly how a team wants to press allows you to really understand a little bit more about what is happening, as opposed to just measuring it with some sort of catch-all, PPDA style figure.
And I think this is what, and this is a bit for me that, you know, makes you think differently, isn't it, about data sometimes? Because, you know, I watched a game last night and, you know, the team were 2-0 down and they just played across the back, centre back to centre back about 10 times. And all they're trying to do is, of course, we hear this terminology, they're trying to provoke the press. Well, the team that are 2-0 up just sat and waited. So they might have made 20 passes, which makes the team that are 2-0 up look really negative in their performance if you just judge that metric. Whereas actually the opposition are doing nothing to them. So in some ways, like you say, it's this opinion of one metric defines the look of the game and the look of a style of play. Whereas actually in Simeone's case, like you say, they're just waiting. They're a transition team. They want the opposition to come into a position where now they're vulnerable, because maybe when we win it, we can bypass more defenders with the next action. And I think this is why context is absolutely everything, in my opinion, within the data, isn't it? And that's just one very good example of that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always like to think of the idea of contextual blind spots, and you know, by no means is our data or the data that anybody else producing at the moment able to look at every single blind spot. There's certain things that football experts have to be able to provide input into. That's one of the beauties of the game. I don't think data will ever figure it out. But, you know, Gary, you mentioned, I think on a previous pod, that at Cambridge, you know, you were kind of forbidden from shooting from range. Now, if you've got Janino from Lyon, or I don't know, Hakan Çalhanoğlu, I don't think you'd ever go at them from shooting from range if they are objectively one of the best long shot takers in world football. It's all about what you've got at your disposal. So this kind of absolutism of not really understanding what the data is telling you is, it can be doing more harm than good. It's an oversimplification of different things. I mean, I think you also covered it a little bit on the previous pod about, you know, in English football, Charles Hughes and probably more Charles Reap were the trailblazers of using data in some way, but they had a very absolutist approach. And they kind of stuck to a certain idea that they figured out the game with the position of optimum opportunity and this kind of percentage game where they wanted to do it within 3 passes and then get a shot away because they saw there was more shots coming from this approach. You know, if you've got, I don't know, Andy Carroll or Kevin Davis up front, that approach probably works really well. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. That's football. It's going to be breaking as many lines as playing through the lines will be on the ground and having a team playing like Barcelona. But if you don't have a team like that, you don't have to conform to this style. I don't think anybody would march into Pep Guardiola's office and say that you should be doing that, because this data says, based on foundings across the entire game, you get more shots away by kicking it long. It's about being able to break it down into that specific game plan that you have as a team.
We had Colin Bailey and Chris Ledbetter in midfield. That was a problem, which is why they've had to play the ball wide. I apologise to those people if they're listening, but they had to play. But it was really interesting, that early sort of being involved in a team that actually used data, probably regardless of how crude it was or how raw that data might have been. It was really interesting to play in a team that actually used data essentially to guide their game model, as opposed to having a game model and looking at the data around it and sort of, trying to see whether the game model's working. It was really, really interesting. So it's probably the first objective team essentially to play the game, around that time. And, again, it was just a really interesting insight for me that, they had all these ways of doing it. The ball had to go wide because if a defender kicked it out of play, you were more likely to score from a long throw in that division. Again, it's context in that division. If you crossed to the back post, you were more likely to score if you then headed it back across, the Pomo position. Again, everyone had nice names for it, didn't they? But essentially, I suppose it comes down to a sort of interesting question. As a coach, are you seeing clubs use the data to underpin their game model, or are you seeing clubs use successful teams, take their data and actually try to implement that into their game model? What would you say around that?
Yeah, I think there probably isn't a uniform approach in terms of how clubs use it. I'd like to say that every club has a club-wide approach, and regardless of whether there's a managerial change or not, they'll stick to a similar script. But very much it's not. It's a bit haphazard. So I think we often see now coaches trying to describe their game with the data that we produce, and I think that can be really, really useful. It probably brings us more onto the topic of recruitment, though, because you need to be able to have those tools at your disposal to play in this way. I think some people do take an idea of a certain team that they really like, and they say, I want to play like them, which is all well and good. But if you march into a club that hasn't got any player that can play anything like Pep Guardiola's Man City, it's probably not going to go very well. The result business in the end of the day, and unfortunately, we don't get enough time to be able to change things for the good of a club over a longer period of time. So I suppose people are trying to prop up their own game model based on this, but I think that's a really good thing. I think we're a big believer of everybody in a club being able to sing off the same hymn sheet. It's the general idea of having data that's not really complicated to understand. Essentially, as much as there's a lot of work that goes into collecting our data, we tend to try and present it in a way that just describes it as players taken out of the game. Because I think that everybody then in a training ground, whether there's somebody who has a background in data or whether it's a player who might not be that interested in it, or even the owner of the club, should theoretically be able to understand what that is, because that's essentially general football speak up and down the country. And if you can describe essentially how you want to take players out of the game and how many that is, it allows everybody to kind of not get lost in the detail of the data and talk about all these very complex models that should theoretically lead you to winning a match. You can at least explain it to everybody so that they understand and they're all on the same page in the end of the day.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you how when you look at the platform, there's such depth to the data, isn't it? We've kind of moved from maybe, I don't want to, kind of paint it in a bad light, but, maybe at Cambridge it was primary colours data, whereas now it's like the whole spectrum. You can look at everything from the attacking metrics to the defensive metrics. You can look at transitions. You can look at time spent in different phases of the game and what people are doing in those phases of the game. Does that mean we're able now to have a wider range of concepts around game models? So it's not just somebody's a pressing team, somebody's a passing team, that there's a far more far greater spectrum that people can look at and almost say, well, in possession they play like this, and out of possession they play like this, but there actually is far greater breadth to the types of ways that people play the game?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose data has had its small part in that to play in terms of how people have decided to build their game models, but I suppose the more detail you can provide, the more chance people have to be able to play in different ways. I always think that tactics within the game are cyclical. What everybody wants to play like at the moment, we could completely different in 20 years' time. And as I mentioned before, I think we don't want to figure out the game and tell everybody that, in order to win a football match, you need to complete a certain amount of passes and pass it on the floor, and you can't kick it long or shoot from distance because that's forbidden, and as there's a smaller chance of winning a game. We want to be able to describe what innovators and essentially coaches can do with the tools that they have at their disposal. So, if they can find a way of winning a football match, we want to be able to describe that as best as possible. If that's part of their game model and it's a slightly nuanced way of playing that's completely different to the team next to them, then the more that you've got a kind of the better way of doing that, providing it's measuring something that's actually describing the game.
I think one thing we would look for, Dave, wouldn't we? If we're in a if we're in a football club, whenever we do it, you've obviously got your game model. You've got probably a lot of the data that maybe shapes how you want to play. So, it won't be every part of the data would be necessary. It's all relevant, but wouldn't necessarily be something we would focus on. But you're looking for trends all the time, aren't you? We're looking for patterns all the time. Let's say if it's bypass defenders, have we got a rough number that we think, or a rough sort of parameter we think actually means we've created chances and played well? If that number starts to drop over a period of time, then for us, maybe it's something we start looking, okay, look, we're not doing that. Why is that? And then you can start to look at the game in a slightly different light when you rewatch matches back. Do you know what I mean? That's how we would tend to view it, as patterns. Would clubs come to you and, how would a club sort of use their game model? Could they shape some of the data, or could they shape a little bit of maybe what you show them in their reports around the way they play?
Yeah, so I guess different clubs are at different stages in terms of how they want to use data, but certainly from measuring how they've played on the pitch, we create custom reports for some teams that will measure specifically what they believe, whether it's a certain number of players they need to bypass, or whether it's how often their own defensive line needs to be broken. We can break that down for them. I think some clubs who are quite advanced on their investment in data and use of data will even have their own platforms that gives different layers of access to, coaches from the first team staff to owners, to be able to let them have a little look at how the team's been playing and whether they've hit those kind of OKRs that they've got of what's absolutely key to winning their games. I think it's nice to have that overall approach. It does, however, again, lead on to the context side of things that, if you want to bypass a certain amount of opponents, that's all well and good. But if you play against Man City one week, it's kind of the debate of whether you should be dogmatic and continue to play in that way, or whether you need to be a little bit more flexible and go, look, it's Man City. We're probably not going to beat them at their own game. We might have to try a different approach here. Is that the right thing for the club? And that's when probably looking at one individual number can probably harm you in a way, specifically when you look at something like a packing KPI. But I think the clubs that are a long way down the use of data within their pathway, they kind of understand this, and the people who are actually assessing the game based on that data will be aware of the fact that it's not going to be exactly the same every single week. You need to add the context of how the team is going to play.